Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's a moment in your life that's so uncanny, it feels like it's straight out of a thriller or horror film? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My dad used to work on oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. One day his harness failed him and he fell into the water. It was a miracle he was saved based on the choppy water and the fact that they used to dump their leftover food into the water. This made sharks an issue. Fast forward 30 years later, when our family went to Puerto Rico. On our first day at the beach, my dad and I got caught in a riptide. We had boogie boards, so when I went under, it wrapped around my neck. My dad was able to make it out and watched in horror as I was beaten by waves and current. Clearly I made it out, but it reminded me of the movie Final Destination. Death skipped my dad and landed on me almost. Death by water, nonetheless. It was the scariest moment of my life, and my wife didn't even know since she was on shore. Imagine dying on the first day of vacation? LOL. It was a full moon a couple months ago. I was staying with a close friend, Elle, at her dad's house, which is a tiny but very quaint and cozy beach cottage a couple of blocks from the ocean. The house is the guest house of the front property, so we were all sleeping in one large room on different beds. We had fallen asleep soundly, but suddenly I woke up in the middle of the night, and as I opened my eyes, I saw that Elle was wide awake too. The room had 3 large skylights, so the moonlight is shining brightly onto us. It was eerily clear that night, and you could see all the stars. We end up talking about all sorts of very morbid topics, mainly on disease, war, starvation, and the fragility of understanding human consciousness. You know, normal 3:30 a.m. type of conversation to have in the dark. We end up talking about how factory-farmed meat that gets fed to us is so horrific, and how bad the shit that gets fed to pets must be. The conversation somehow got onto the topic of being watched through the skylights, after discussing UFOs and aliens. Right after we brought that up, Elle looked at me with absolute horror in her eyes and face, and her mouth dropped open. Scared silent, her finger pointed directly up and behind me. She managed to whisper, "Look behind you." Adrenaline was pumping through me as I couldn't imagine what could be instigating that sort of reaction, especially after all the spooky stuff we'd just been talking about. I managed to turn my head around and look up at the skylight, and I jumped about 3 feet in the air off the bed and screamed bloody murder. 2 yellow eyes were peering in from the skylight, and then a small dark figure they belonged to scurried away. Elle and I looked back at each other and held each other, and then we started breathing shakily, and Elle started laughing. Scared shitless, I was like, "What the was that?" It was a cat, concluded. Regardless if it was a cat or not, it totally could have been. Cats can climb high roofs. I'll never forget the look on her face and the terror surrounding the slow turnaround to see eyes staring at us in the above window in the moonlight. Cat or not, creepy as... Yeah, I mean, this is good because a lot of times things that are the most frightening and fear-inducing are just a normal thing at a wrong time of night. So I could see how a cat could do that for sure. Probably did it on purpose, because you know how cats are. I remember being 7 years old. Me and my sister would go up this steep road with our skateboards, sit down on them, and ride down on the path. One day we went down the path, and at the bottom of the road it has a huge turn. So as we were going, a bus was next to us, and we couldn't turn. And as soon as the bus turned, we nearly went straight into it, but the bus slammed on the brakes. Someone on that bus knew my dad, so they called him and told him what happened. When me and my sister got home, my dad told us that we had killed 2 people on the bus because of what we did. We felt ashamed and heartbroken, knowing we had killed people. Until we turned 18 and my dad said, "You didn't really kill anyone." I've never felt so much anger in my life. I was made to believe that I killed innocent people for most of my teenage life. I never used to believe in ciphers. I heard stories about them and thought they were cool, but I always told myself there's no way. A few months ago, my boyfriend and I took my dog outside to use the bathroom. It's probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, and we're both having trouble sleeping, so we decided to smoke on my back porch. After being outside for probably about 5 to 10 minutes, Out of nowhere, it gets super cold. All the crickets stop chirping, and the early morning birds follow suit. The only noise is the wind blowing in the trees. Suddenly there comes what can only be described as a barking noise about 60 feet from my house. It's quiet at first, but it doesn't take long before we can both hear it without straining our ears. It gets louder, but I can't see the source of this noise due to obstacles obscuring my sight in that direction. It just keeps repeating the same sound over and over like a recording, about every 15 seconds. It sounds the same every time, and that's what makes my hair stand on end. My neighbors have dogs, but they're all Chihuahuas and Yorkies. Even if they were big dogs, I don't think this is a big dog. I don't know what it is, but it sounds fake. I don't know, it's hard to explain. You just had to be there. My boyfriend and I got too creeped out and put out what we were smoking, call in my dog, and go to bed. The same thing happened the next night. We couldn't sleep again, so we took my dog out at around the same time as last night. The noise starts up almost immediately. It's faster this time and somewhat louder, but it stays at the same the entire time we're out. Maybe we were feeling brave, or maybe because we were stupid, not mutually exclusive. But we stayed out for longer. Nothing happened, which is something I'm grateful for. After a little while, though, the noise stopped. My boyfriend and I wondered what the noise could have been, but there were no theories other than something scary. We went 2 nights without the noise to our relief, but on the third it came back. For whatever reason, with vengeance. My boyfriend was just standing on the porch while listening and whistling a tune when the noise came back. It was louder than ever. Beforehand, there were 10 to 15 second intervals between the barks, but now they were more aggressive. It was just barking constantly. It was still the same old recording. We went inside immediately. Skipping forward, it's been about a month since I last heard the noise. Before then, it decreased in frequency, going from happening every night to roughly 4 nights a week to 2 nights a week, and then gone. My boyfriend and I were so invested in this that we acted like a couple of little idiots and investigated where the noise was coming from, but only in the daytime, of course. There was nothing there. No nest or anything, just dirt like everything else. I never found out what it was, and though I'm very curious, I admit that a large part of me also doesn't really want to know out of fear. It was about 43 years ago when my mother decided she was through with the man, my little sister's father, that we were living with. So we loaded into the car and made our way from a tiny little backwoods Montana town to a tiny little backwoods Oregon coast town. For a while, we stayed with my mother's friend and her family, but after a few weeks, Mom had found us a place to stay that would be our own, at least for a while. This was the summer before my becoming a third grader, right around 1980. Our new home was an old travel trailer. You know, the kind that you would tow behind a pickup truck to go camping in the woods? The sofa, dining area became Mom's bed, and there was a small set of bunk beds for my sister and me. It really wasn't much, but we made it our home. Chris was the property owner, and the trailer was parked on his property, about 30 yards from the house. There were a few old junker vehicles around. He had a couple of mean dogs, and one of them eventually ripped an eyeball out of my sister's new puppy because the pup had approached the food dish. There were train tracks right behind the trailer, hell. I mean, right behind, maybe 15 to 20 yards away. And trains ran those tracks multiple times per day and night. Not ideal by any means. I'm going to pause here to provide you with some interesting information that I had later discovered. Keep in mind that I did not know any of this at the time. 1. Just prior to our moving in, Chris's father had blown his brains out in a happy little home. If the interior had been painted instead of the nasty-ass wood paneling, then the new paint would have barely been dried when we moved in. 2. Just about 100 yards into the woods north of us was an old cemetery. I've been there as an adult, and it's horrific. Old rusted-out shells of long-dead cars have been abandoned in the middle of old, forgotten plots, some of which have headstones so warm as to be unreadable. Some random assholes had decided this was a great place to toss their trash, so things like old mattresses and dryers were left among the dead as well. Simply disgusting. However, the reason I had visited the cemetery was because I had heard that certain rituals had once occurred there. I was looking to see if I could find any evidence of this. 3. As an adult, I learned that my little sister heard the same noises that I did at night. Returning to 1980. After going to bed each night, just as I was drifting into that place between consciousness and the realm of sleep, I would hear this startling sound. It was the chuffing cough of a large dog snapping its fangs together in the air mere inches from my ear. I slept in the top bunk, and the sound always came from the wall side. When I think about it to this day, I can still remember that sound. Mom brushed it off as nightmares and would send me back to bed each night. I don't think she ever really believed me, so I just stopped going to her about it and would lay there, afraid to fall asleep, but eventually doing so, only to be awakened by the snap yet again. I wonder if he had overcome or just used to it, because the impression of this just sort of fades away into memory. However, this wasn't the only sleep-related oddity floating around back then. According to Mom, I had suddenly become quite the sleepwalker. I would randomly get out of bed, grab some toys, and start playing with them. Or I would walk just over to Mom and engage in conversation with her, but starting in the middle of it, as if I were already in discussion with someone else. She later told me that this had freaked her the hell out. Well, one late night, I had just gotten out of bed and went to the front door and only door, grabbed the knob and was getting ready to head outside. Mom, being still awake and right there by the door, asked me just what I thought I was doing. I told her that I needed to go to Tommy's house to play. Being fairly used to this by now, my mother simply tried to redirect me back to bed. At this point, I dodged her attempt, scrambled onto her bed, said, "But look, Mom," and opened the curtains. Tommy was my friend who lived across the street. Tommy's house was fully engulfed in flames. Fortunately, nobody was home that night, as their family was out of town. The house was burned to the ground before the fire department arrived. What made me want to go to Tommy's house? What made those horrible dog noises in my ear? Yes, my sister and I had each received a new pup, but they were smaller dogs, not capable of the nightly clubs up to the top bunk to snap their neck in my ear, then disappear. Also, after living with us for a few short months, both dogs failed to come when called to breakfast one morning. It was summer, and the trailer was small, so the dogs slept outside. They were pups, but about a year old from what I remember. And the yard was fenced in along the street. After a short break, I found that the dogs on the road, they were both dead, apparently having been run over by a drunk or malicious driver. From the UK here, but basically I live out in the countryside and was coming back from a long walk out in the fields. It was pretty much pitch black, but I was only about 2 minutes walk away from the car. I was in sort of long grass when all of a sudden I heard something sounded like the size of a dog come running straight at me through the woods. You could really hear the thuds of his footsteps. So I froze and screamed toward its direction, and the footsteps stopped. Then they started to slowly circle me in this field, like whatever it was stalking me. It went around the back of me, and so I sprinted as fast as I could out of there as quick as possible. Was more than likely just a badger, but my God, it felt like horror. I have 3 kids. My eldest was 2 months old when his dad killed himself. We weren't together at that stage. He had left me for someone else, but we were on good terms. My twins were 6 months old when their dad killed himself. We were living together and engaged. I just found out he had been cheating the entire time I was hospitalized during my traumatic pregnancy. With that, 4 hours away from our home, and I told him I knew he was still cheating. I asked him to watch the kids for 30 minutes so I could finish off a customer order. 10 minutes in, they're both crying, and he's nowhere to be found. I searched the house for him, but nothing. I went outside and found him hanging in our garage. My eldest was with me and seen. I panicked and tried to cut him down with a large sharp knife. Due to his weight, it didn't work. I'm trying to call 000, but my phone wouldn't connect. It had never happened before. Still in shock and panicking, I run down our street screaming for help, but no one is to be found. I returned back to the kitchen, this time getting a serrated knife, and was able to cut the drop off right there. And I started CPR and continued trying to call 000, and eventually got through to them and contacted CPR. The whole time my eldest watched while my twins were inside crying. They'd gotten a heartbeat, but days later he was declared brain dead and was taken off of life support. 3 days after his death, his family served me with court papers. They looked to court because I was classified as a senior next to him. He had gone into zero contact with them after they refused to meet their grandchildren because Robert, 3 days after his death, his family served me with court papers. They took me to court because I was classified as his senior next of kin. He had gone into zero contact with them after they refused to meet their grandchildren because we said they couldn't smoke around our very preemie unwell babies. The legal stuff is still ongoing. I live in a possessed house when I was like 8 or 9 years old. My mom decided to finish a relationship with my stepdad because he was toxic. A friend of my mom decided to offer his house to us, mom, brother, and me. He was living alone in that apartment, so we're going to be his roommates. They knew from childhood. Eventually, he and my mom started dating. Here's the spooky part. I always felt like the house was way too dark, but I thought that maybe it was just an idea. During our first visit of living there, we'd heard like someone was throwing rocks in our roof. We ran outside and there wasn't a single person. This continued to happen for months. We started fighting continuously because we all ended up being angry for everything, which was uncommon for us. I mean, we had fights, but not that often and not that violent. The house had 2 enormous rooms, so I shared with my brother, and we had all the TVs in our living room. During our first month living in the house, the TV in the living room turned on alone. The volume used to increase and decrease. The channels changed in the living room and turned on alone. And we had TV in that room. The TV in the living room had turned on alone. The volume used to increase and decrease. The channels changed, and when someone walked in, the TV turned off. I was grounded for that a couple of times because my mom thought it was me. But my brother told her one time that he was awake because of the volume and saw me in bed across the room completely asleep. That's when my mom started considering that something was wrong with the place. She started looking for other places so we could move out ASAP. Months passed. My mom has 1 or 2 shifts at night during the year. She used to sleep some hours during the morning when my brother and I attended school, and then she spent some time with us during the afternoon. We used to sleep early, so around 8 to 9 we got into bed until the next morning. My mom used to come to our room to say goodbye before leaving for her shift. And then we heard her knocking in our window. We thought that it was just her saying goodbye, but some days later than that, sounds woke up my brother. As I said before, we had a lot of fights, so one day my brother told my mom that it was enough for her to say goodbye in our room and requested that she stop knocking in the window. She and her boyfriend looked at each other and said that she never did that, nor did he, because they didn't want to wake us up. At the end of the week, my mom took my brother and me to our grandparents' house and moved in there during the next week. She didn't say much to me, but she did tell my brother the reason, as he was older in that moment. She said that a couple of days after he told her about the knocking, she decided to sleep in our room during the day and she heard it. She said loudly, "Please leave us alone." The TV in the living room turned on. She walked outside and she told my brother that she saw a shadow figure running to the kitchen to hide between our fridges. We had 2. That's a different story. She grabbed her stuff and left the house. She went to the church and told the priest something wicked in her house and recommended having to leave before the summer or worse thing happening. My mom asked her ex. He didn't want us to leave about the situation. He said that when he was young, he and his cousins played the Ouija board and got way too scared. So they left the game open for almost 40 years. That shit was open, gathering energy.